In the early 20th century, nestled deep within the Bavarian countryside of Germany, lay a secluded farmstead known as Hinterkaifeck. Approximately 70 kilometers north of Munich, this remote homestead was surrounded by dense forests and sprawling fields, with the nearest neighbors residing miles away. The isolation of Hinterkaifeck rendered it a world unto itself, detached from the bustling life of nearby towns. The farm was established around 1863 and had seen generations of the Gruber family toil its lands. By 1922, the farm was home to Andreas Gruber, a 63-year-old patriarch known for his stern and reclusive nature, his wife, Cecilia, aged 72, their widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel, 35, and Victoria's two children, 7-year-old Cecilia and 2-year-old Joseph. The family led a modest life, tending to their livestock and fields, with little interaction with the outside world. Despite their seclusion, whispers about the Gruber family permeated the local communities. Rumors hinted at an incestuous relationship between Andreas and his daughter Victoria, a scandalous allegation that cast a shadow over the family's reputation. Victoria's son, Joseph, was believed by some to be the product of this forbidden union, while others speculated that he was fathered by Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighboring farmer and widower who had been romantically linked to Victoria after his first wife's death in 1918. The Gruber's previous maid had left her position 6 months prior, citing unsettling sounds emanating from the attic and an overwhelming sense of unease, leading her to believe the property was haunted. Undeterred, the family continued their daily routines, dismissing the maid's concerns as mere superstition. In the weeks leading up to the fateful events, Andreas Gruber began noticing peculiar occurrences around the farmstead. He discovered a strange newspaper from Munich on the property, a publication he did not recall purchasing. Initially, he assumed it belonged to the postman, but inquiries revealed that no one in the vicinity subscribed to that particular paper. More disturbingly, Andreas found tracks in the fresh snow leading from the dense forest to a broken door lock in the farm's machine room. The footprints led directly to the farm, but conspicuously did not lead away, suggesting an intruder had entered but never exited. Despite thorough searches of the property, no one was found. At night, the family heard footsteps echoing from the attic. Andreas, armed with a lantern, would ascend the creaky stairs to investigate, only to find the space empty. These unexplained sounds, coupled with the earlier discoveries, unsettled the family. Andreas confided in neighbors about these strange events, but when offers of assistance were extended, he declined, choosing to handle the matters privately. Adding to the growing sense of dread, young Cecilia confided in a school friend that her mother, Victoria, had fled the farm the night before after a violent quarrel, only to be found hours later in the nearby forest. The reasons for this dispute and Victoria's subsequent flight remained a mystery, further deepening the aura of unease surrounding Hinterkaifeck. On the afternoon of March 31st, 1922, Maria Baumgartner, a 44-year-old maid, arrived at Hinterkaifeck to begin her employment. She was escorted by her sister, who stayed briefly before departing. Unbeknownst to Maria, this would be her first and last day at the farm. That evening, as darkness enveloped the remote homestead, an unimaginable horror unfolded. It is believed that the perpetrator lured family members to the barn one by one. Andreas, his wife Cecilia, their daughter Victoria, and granddaughter Cecilia were each led to their deaths, succumbing to brutal blows from a mattock, a farming tool commonly used in the region. The assailant then moved into the living quarters, where Maria and little Josef met the same gruesome fate. The bodies were subsequently covered, those in the barn with hay, and the ones inside the house with bed linens, a macabre attempt to conceal the atrocity. 4 days passed without any sign of life from Hinterkaifeck. Neighbors grew concerned when young Cecilia failed to attend school, and the family was conspicuously absent from Sunday worship. On April 4, 1922, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, driven by unease, sent his son Johann and stepson Josef to check on the Gruber family. When the boys reported no response, Schlittenbauer assembled a small group, including Michael Pearl and Jakob Siegel, to investigate further. Upon arriving at the farm, they found the barn door locked. After forcing entry, they were met with a ghastly scene: the lifeless bodies of Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, and young Cecilia, stacked atop one another amidst the straw. Venturing into the living quarters, they discovered the remains of Maria Baumgartner and 2-year-old Josef, each brutally slain in their respective rooms. The local authorities were summoned, and Inspector Georg Reingruber and his team took charge of the investigation. However, the crime scene had been inadvertently compromised. Curious neighbors had entered the house, moved items, and even prepared meals in the kitchen, contaminating potential evidence. Court physician Johann Baptist Aumüller conducted autopsies on the victims in the barn. He concluded that a mattock was the likely murder weapon, though it was not immediately found. Evidence indicated that young Cecilia had survived for several hours after the initial attack, as clumps of her hair were found in her hands, a sign of the agony she endured. The victims' skulls were removed and sent to Munich for further examination. In the weeks leading up to the tragic events at Hinterkaifeck, a series of unsettling occurrences began to disturb the otherwise monotonous life of the Gruber family. These incidents, seemingly innocuous at first, gradually wove a tapestry of dread that enveloped the secluded farmstead. It started with a newspaper. One crisp morning in March 1922, Andreas Gruber discovered a Munich newspaper on his property. Given the farm's isolation and the family's limited contact with the outside world, this was an unusual find. Andreas did not recall purchasing or subscribing to any such publication. His initial thought was that the postman might have accidentally dropped it, but upon inquiry, he learned that no one in the vicinity subscribed to that particular paper. This minor mystery left Andreas puzzled, but he soon dismissed it, attributing it to a possible mistake by a passer-by. Shortly thereafter, a more disturbing discovery was made. After a light snowfall, Andreas noticed distinct footprints leading from the dense forest that bordered his land directly to a broken door lock in the farm's machine room. The peculiarity of these tracks was that while they led towards the farm, there were no corresponding footprints leading away. It was as if someone had approached the farm, entered, and never left. Alarmed, Andreas conducted a thorough search of the property, inspecting every room, the attic, and even the barn, but found no intruder. Despite the unsettling nature of this discovery, he chose not to report it to the authorities, perhaps due to a stoic belief in handling matters privately, or a reluctance to involve outsiders in his affairs. As days turned into nights, the Gruber family began experiencing disturbances within their home. During the stillness of the night, they heard footsteps echoing from the attic above. The creaking of floorboards and the occasional muffled thud disrupted their sleep. Andreas, determined to protect his family, would arm himself with a lantern and cautiously ascend the creaky stairs to the attic. Each time, he found the space empty, with no signs of habitation or disturbance. These nocturnal noises became a regular occurrence, instilling a growing sense of unease among the family members. The farm's previous maid had left her position 6 months prior, citing these very disturbances as her reason for departure. She had claimed that the farm was haunted, recounting tales of unexplained sounds and an oppressive atmosphere. The Grubers had dismissed her concerns as mere superstition, attributing her experiences to an overactive imagination. However, with the recurrence of these events, the family's skepticism began to wane, replaced by a creeping sense of dread. In addition to these auditory disturbances, other inexplicable events plagued the household. A set of house keys went missing, despite meticulous searches. Doors that were firmly locked at night were found ajar in the morning. Items within the house seemed to move of their own accord, with tools and utensils not being where they were last placed. The livestock, usually calm and predictable, began displaying signs of agitation, often found restless and uneasy without any apparent cause. The culmination of these events took a more personal turn when young Cecilia confided in a school friend about a disturbing incident. She recounted that her mother, Victoria, had fled the farm one night after a heated argument with Andreas. Victoria was found hours later, wandering in the nearby forest, disoriented and distressed. The specifics of the quarrel remained unknown, but this episode added another layer to the family's growing apprehension. Despite these unsettling occurrences, Andreas Gruber remained reticent about seeking external help. He mentioned the strange happenings to a few neighbors, but declined their offers of assistance. His decision to keep matters within the family could have stemmed from a deep-seated mistrust of outsiders or a desire to maintain the family's privacy. Whatever the reason, this choice would later be viewed with regret, as the ominous signs foreshadowed a tragedy that would soon engulf Hinterkaifeck. The Gruber family's experiences in those final weeks paint a haunting picture of a household besieged by an unseen menace. The combination of unexplained footprints, nocturnal disturbances, missing items, and personal turmoil created an atmosphere thick with tension and fear. In hindsight, these events appear as harbingers of the impending doom that would forever mark Hinterkaifeck as the site of one of Germany's most chilling unsolved mysteries. As March 1922 drew to a close, the Gruber family of Hinterkaifeck prepared for a change in their household. After months without domestic help, following the abrupt departure of their previous maid, who had been unsettled by the farm's eerie atmosphere, they anticipated the arrival of a new maid, Maria Baumgartner. Maria, a 44-year-old woman from a nearby village, had been recommended to the Grubers and was eager to begin her new position. On the afternoon of March 31st, Maria's sister accompanied her to the Hinterkaifeck farmstead. The journey was uneventful, and upon arrival, Maria was introduced to the family. Andreas and Cecilia Gruber, their daughter Victoria Gabriel, and her 2 children, 7-year-old Cecilia and 2-year-old Joseph. The family welcomed Maria warmly, showing her around the property and familiarizing her with her duties. After a brief visit, Maria's sister bid her farewell, leaving the farmstead to return home. Unbeknownst to both women, this would be their final parting. As evening descended upon Hinterkaifeck, the household settled into their routines. The day's labors had been typical, tending to the livestock, maintaining the fields, and performing household chores. The children played under the watchful eyes of their mother and grandparents, while Maria unpacked her belongings and arranged her modest quarters. The farmstead, though isolated, exuded a sense of normalcy and routine. However, the tranquility of that evening would soon be shattered by an unimaginable horror. As darkness enveloped the remote homestead, a sinister presence lurked, waiting to execute a meticulously planned atrocity. It is believed that the perpetrator, familiar with the farm's layout and the family's routines, initiated the massacre by luring the family members into the barn. The exact sequence of events remains a subject of speculation, but prevailing theories suggest that the assailant created a disturbance within the stable area, possibly agitating the animals to draw attention. Concerned by the commotion, one or more family members likely ventured into the barn to investigate. Once inside the dimly lit barn, the unsuspecting victims were ambushed. The murderer wielded a mattock, a farming tool resembling a pickaxe, commonly used in the region. With calculated brutality, the assailant delivered fatal blows to each victim's head. The sequence in which the family members were killed is uncertain, but it is widely believed that Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, and young Cecilia were murdered in the barn, one after another. The methodical nature of the killing suggests a cold-blooded precision, indicating that the perpetrator was either intimately familiar with the victims or harbored a deep-seated animosity towards them. After dispatching the family members in the barn, the murderer turned their attention to the living quarters. Entering the farmhouse, the assailant proceeded to Maria Baumgartner's room. Having only arrived that afternoon, Maria was likely unacquainted with the farm's nocturnal sounds and may have been resting after her journey. She, too, fell victim to the assailant's ruthless attack, succumbing to fatal head injuries inflicted by the same mattock. The final victim was 2-year-old Joseph, who was asleep in his bassinet in his mother's room. The innocence of his slumber was no shield against the assailant's malevolence. The toddler was mercilessly struck down, his life extinguished before it had truly begun. In the aftermath of the slaughter, the murderer took deliberate steps to conceal the atrocities. The bodies in the barn were meticulously covered with hay, while those inside the house were shrouded with bed linens. This act of covering the corpses suggests a complex psychological state. It could indicate remorse, a desire to delay discovery, or an attempt to maintain a facade of normalcy. The care taken in concealing the bodies implies that the perpetrator was not in a hurried state, further suggesting familiarity with the farm and confidence that they would not be interrupted. In the days that followed, the Hinterkaifeck farmstead remained eerily active. Neighbors reported seeing smoke rising from the chimney, and the livestock appeared well fed. This led investigators to conclude that the murderer had remained on the property for several days after the killings, tending to daily chores and consuming meals from the family's provisions. The audacity of such actions indicates a chilling level of composure and detachment from the heinous acts committed. The discovery of the crime would not occur until April 4, 1922, when concerned neighbors, noting the family's unusual absence, ventured onto the property. The gruesome scene that awaited them would haunt the community for generations to come. The arrival of Maria Baumgartner at Hinterkaifeck was meant to usher in a period of assistance and relief for the Gruber family. Instead, it coincided with a night of unparalleled horror, culminating in one of Germany's most infamous unsolved massacres. The events of that fateful evening remain shrouded in mystery, leaving behind a legacy of unanswered questions and enduring sorrow. In the days following the massacre at Hinterkaifeck, an unsettling silence enveloped the farmstead. The once bustling activities ceased abruptly, and the absence of the Gruber family began to draw the attention of the local community. Neighbors, accustomed to the rhythms of rural life, noticed the unusual stillness and became increasingly concerned. On April 1st, 1922, coffee sellers Hans and Eduard Shirovsky arrived at Hinterkaifeck to take an order. Upon knocking on the door and receiving no response, they circled the property but found no signs of life. The gate to the machine house stood open, yet the farm was eerily quiet. Perplexed but not overly alarmed, the brothers departed, assuming the family was away or occupied. As days passed, the absence of young Cecilia from school without excuse and the family's conspicuous absence from Sunday worship raised further alarm. The Grubers were known for their regular church attendance, and their failure to appear was out of character. Neighbors began to speculate about the family's whereabouts, with some recalling Andreas Gruber's recent accounts of strange occurrences at the farm. On April 4th, 1922, Albert Hoffner, a local mechanic, visited Hinterkaifeck to repair a diesel engine. Upon arrival, he found the farmstead silent, with only the sounds of animals breaking the stillness. After waiting for an hour and calling out to no avail, Hoffner proceeded with his work, completing the repair over the course of several hours. His presence on the farm during this time, without encountering any of the residents, added to the growing mystery. Later that day, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighbor with personal ties to the Gruber family, grew increasingly uneasy. He sent his son Johann and stepson Joseph to check on the family. When the boys reported no response and an unsettling silence, Schlittenbauer assembled a small group, including Michael Pohl and Jakob Siegel, to investigate further. Upon arriving at Hinterkaifeck, the men found the barn door locked. After forcing entry, they were met with a ghastly scene: the lifeless bodies of Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, and young Cecilia, stacked atop one another amidst the straw. The victims had been brutally attacked, their skulls displaying severe trauma. The horror of the discovery was compounded by the realization that these heinous acts had occurred days prior, with the bodies lying undiscovered all the while. Venturing into the living quarters, the men discovered the remains of Maria Baumgartner and 2-year-old Joseph. Maria was found in her bedchamber, while Joseph lay lifeless in his bassinet. The brutality inflicted upon such a young child was particularly harrowing, leaving the men in a state of shock and disbelief. The local authorities were promptly summoned, and Inspector Georg Reingruber and his team from the Munich Police Department took charge of the investigation. However, the crime scene had been inadvertently compromised. Curious neighbors had entered the house, moved items, and even prepared meals in the kitchen, contaminating potential evidence. This lack of scene preservation posed significant challenges for the investigators. As evening descended upon Hinterkaifeck, the household settled into their routines. The day's labors had been typical: tending to the livestock, maintaining the fields, and performing household chores. The children played under the watchful eyes of their mother and grandparents, while Maria unpacked her belongings and arranged her modest quarters. The farmstead, though isolated, exuded a sense of normalcy and routine. Court physician Johann Baptist Aumler conducted autopsies on the victims in the barn. He concluded that a mattock was the likely murder weapon, though it was not immediately found. Evidence indicated that young Cecilia had survived for several hours after the initial attack, as clumps of her hair were found in her hands, a sign of the agony she endured. The victims' skulls were removed and sent to Munich for further examination. The initial theory posited robbery as the motive. However, a substantial amount of money was found within the house, seemingly untouched. This led investigators to consider alternative motives, including personal vendettas or familial disputes. The discovery that the perpetrator had remained at the farm for several days after the murders, tending to the livestock and consuming the family's food supplies, added a chilling dimension to the case. The investigation faced numerous challenges, not least the compromised crime scene and the lack of clear evidence pointing to a definitive suspect. Despite extensive inquiries and the consideration of various suspects, the Hinterkaifeck murders remain one of Germany's most infamous unsolved crimes, leaving a legacy of unanswered questions and enduring intrigue. In the aftermath of the gruesome discovery at Hinterkaifeck, the Bavarian authorities faced the daunting task of unraveling a crime that would confound investigators for decades. Inspector Georg Reingruber and his team from the Munich Police Department were assigned to the case, but from the outset the investigation was fraught with challenges. One of the most significant obstacles was the compromised crime scene. Before the authorities arrived, numerous neighbors and curious onlookers had traversed the farmstead. In their attempts to make sense of the macabre scene, they inadvertently tampered with potential evidence. Bodies were moved, household items were displaced, and, astonishingly, meals were prepared and consumed in the kitchen. This contamination severely hindered the investigators' ability to piece together the sequence of events leading to the murders. On April 5, 1922, court physician Johann Baptist Aumüller conducted autopsies on the victims in the barn. His examination revealed that a mattock, a type of pickaxe commonly used in farming, was the likely murder weapon, though it was not immediately located. The brutality of the attacks was evident. Each victim had suffered severe head trauma. Tragically, it was determined that young Cecilia had survived for several hours after the initial assault. Clumps of her hair were found clutched in her hands, indicating she had torn it out in distress as she lay dying. To facilitate further examination, the victims' skulls were removed and sent to Munich. In a bid to glean additional insights, these skulls were later given to clairvoyants, though no useful information emerged from these consultations. Initially, robbery was suspected as the motive. However, this theory was quickly abandoned when substantial sums of money were found untouched within the farmhouse. The investigators then considered the possibility of a personal vendetta or familial dispute. The discovery that the perpetrator had remained at the farm for several days after the murders, feeding the livestock, consuming the family's food, and maintaining the household, added a chilling dimension to the crime. This behavior suggested a level of familiarity with the farm and its operations, leading some to speculate that the killer was someone known to the family. The list of suspects grew as the investigation progressed. One of the earliest was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighboring farmer. Schlittenbauer had been intimately acquainted with the Gruber family and was rumored to be the father of Victoria's youngest child, Joseph. His actions upon discovering the bodies raised suspicions. He reportedly unlocked the front door of the farmhouse with a key, despite claims that a key had gone missing days before the murders. Additionally, Schlittenbauer's demeanor was noted to be unusually composed, and he made comments that some interpreted as indicating prior knowledge of the crime. However, despite these suspicions, no concrete evidence linked him to the murders, and he was never charged. Another line of inquiry focused on the Gump brothers, Adolf and Anton. In 1951, decades after the crime, prosecutor Andreas Popp reopened the case, prompted by a deathbed confession from the brothers' sister, Crescentia Mayer. She claimed that her brothers had committed the murders. Anton was arrested, but with Adolf having died in 1944 and insufficient evidence to corroborate the confession, the case against Anton was eventually dismissed. Over the years, various other individuals fell under suspicion. The Bischler brothers, Anton and Karl, were considered due to their familiarity with the farm and alleged statements expressing animosity towards the Gruber family. Peter Weber was implicated by a former acquaintance, Joseph Betz, who claimed that Weber had discussed the remote location of Hinterkaifeck and suggested killing the family for their money. The Thaler brothers were also suspected, based on statements from the former maid, Crescens Rieger, who recounted unsettling encounters with Joseph Thaler. Despite these numerous leads, the investigation was hampered by a lack of concrete evidence. The forensic techniques of the time were limited, and the initial contamination of the crime scene further impeded efforts to identify the perpetrator. The case was officially closed in 1955, with no charges brought against any of the suspects. The last known interrogation related to the case occurred in 1986, shortly before the retirement of Detective Chief Superintendent Conrad Müller. In the years that followed, the Hinterkaifeck murders became the subject of extensive speculation and analysis. Theories ranged from the plausible to the fantastical, but none provided a definitive answer to the mystery. The farmstead itself was demolished in 1923, a year after the murders, perhaps in an attempt to erase the grim memory of the events. Yet the story of Hinterkaifeck endures, a haunting reminder of a crime that has never been solved. The legacy of the Hinterkaifeck investigation is one of frustration and sorrow. Despite the efforts of law enforcement and the interest of countless amateur sleuths, the question of who committed these brutal murders remains unanswered. The case stands as a testament to the limitations of early 20th century forensic science and the enduring enigma of human malevolence. Once inside the dimly lit barn, the unsuspecting victims were ambushed. The murderer wielded a mattock, a farming tool resembling a pickaxe, commonly used in the region. With calculated brutality, the assailant delivered fatal blows to each victim's head. The sequence in which the family members were killed is uncertain, but it is widely believed that Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, and young Cecilia were murdered in the barn, one after another. The methodical nature of the killings suggests a cold-blooded precision, indicating that the perpetrator was either intimately familiar with the victims or harbored a deep-seated animosity towards them. The Hinterkaifeck murders have, over the decades, become a fertile ground for speculation, with numerous theories attempting to explain the brutal slayings of the Gruber family. The absence of a clear motive and the lack of conclusive evidence have led to a myriad of hypotheses, each weaving its own narrative around the enigmatic events of that fateful night. Another line of inquiry focused on the Gump brothers, Adolf and Anton. In 1951, decades after the crime, prosecutor Andreas Popp reopened the case, prompted by a deathbed confession from the brothers' sister, Crescentia Mayer. She claimed that her brothers had committed the murders. Anton was arrested, but with Adolf having died in 1944 and insufficient evidence to corroborate the confession, the case against Anton was eventually dismissed. Erstens, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor with a motive. One of the most discussed suspects is Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighboring farmer who had personal ties to the Gruber family. Following the death of his first wife in 1918, Schlittenbauer was believed to have been romantically involved with Victoria Gabriel, the widowed daughter of Andreas and Cecilia Gruber. This relationship led to speculations that Schlittenbauer might have been the father of Victoria's youngest child, Joseph. Several actions and statements by Schlittenbauer raised suspicions. Upon discovering the bodies, he reportedly used a key to access the farmhouse, despite claims that a key had gone missing days before the murders. When questioned about entering the house alone, potentially while the murderer was still present, Schlittenbauer allegedly stated that he was searching for his son, Joseph. His familiarity with the farmstead and certain comments he made were interpreted by some as indications of prior knowledge of the crime. A prevailing theory suggests that Schlittenbauer committed the murders due to a dispute over financial support for Joseph. Victoria had reportedly demanded child support, which might have led to a confrontation culminating in the massacre. However, despite these suspicions, no concrete evidence linked Schlittenbauer to the crime, and he was never charged. Before his death in 1941, Schlittenbauer won several civil claims for slander against individuals who had labeled him as the murderer. 2. Carl Gabriel, the husband who never returned. Another theory centers on Carl Gabriel, Victoria's husband, who was reportedly killed in December 1914 during World War I. His body was never recovered, leading to speculations that he might have survived and returned to Hinterkaifeck. The fact that Victoria gave birth to Joseph after Carl's reported death fueled rumors about the child's paternity, with some suggesting an incestuous relationship between Victoria and her father, Andreas. Some postulate that if Carl had survived the war and discovered the alleged incest upon his return, it could have driven him to commit the murders in a fit of rage. However, this theory remains speculative, as there is no concrete evidence to suggest that Carl survived the war or returned to Hinterkaifeck. 3. The Gump Brothers, a deathbed confession. In 1951, a new lead emerged when prosecutor Andreas Popp investigated brothers Adolf and Anton Gump. Their sister, Crescentia Meyer, had allegedly made a deathbed confession implicating her brothers in the Hinterkaifeck murders. Adolf had died in 1944, but Anton was arrested and later released due to insufficient evidence. The case against him was eventually dismissed in 1954. The Gump brothers' alleged involvement remains one of the many unresolved threads in the tapestry of theories surrounding the case. 4. Andreas Gruber, the patriarch-turned-perpetrator. Some theories propose that Andreas Gruber himself was the murderer. Known for his abusive behavior and the rumored incestuous relationship with his daughter, it's speculated that Andreas might have killed his family members before taking his own life. This would explain the lack of forced entry and the apparent familiarity of the perpetrator with the farm. However, this theory is challenged by the fact that Andreas was found among the victims, with injuries consistent with an external attack. Moreover, the brutality of the murders and the subsequent actions of the perpetrator suggest the involvement of another party. 5. A random drifter or soldier. Another theory posits that the murders were committed by a passing drifter or a soldier, possibly someone with a grudge against the family, or simply a dangerous vagrant seeking shelter. This would account for the strange footprints leading to the farm and the lack of an obvious suspect within the community. However, the perpetrator's apparent familiarity with the farmstead and the deliberate actions taken after the murders such as feeding the livestock and consuming the family's food, make this theory less plausible. 6. Paul Mueller, the international serial killer. In their 2017 book, The Man from the Train, authors Bill James and Rachel McCarthy. James proposed that a German immigrant named Paul Mueller might have been responsible for the Hinterkaifeck murders. Mueller was a suspect in several family murders in the United States between 1898 and 1912, which bore similarities to the Hinterkaifeck case. The murders attributed to Mueller involved entire families being bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument, often in their homes near railroad tracks. The authors suggest that Mueller might have returned to Germany and continued his killing spree, with Hinterkaifeck being one of his crimes. While intriguing, this theory remains speculative, with no direct evidence linking Mueller to the Hinterkaifeck murders. 7. Occult practices and supernatural theories. Some of the more outlandish theories suggest that the murders were connected to occult practices or supernatural phenomena. The isolated location of the farm, the eerie occurrences leading up to the murders, and the sheer brutality of the crime have led some to speculate about otherworldly involvement. However, these theories lack credible evidence and are generally dismissed by serious investigators. Conclusion: the Hinterkaifeck murders remain one of Germany's most enigmatic unsolved crimes. Each theory presents its own narrative, weaving together fragments of evidence and speculation. Yet, none have provided a definitive answer to the haunting question: who committed the Hinterkaifeck murders? As time passes, the truth becomes ever more elusive, leaving